From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. Speaking of subpoenas, the House January 6th committee has now, as of this afternoon, sent its subpoena over to President Trump. There's a Wall Street Journal story up on it a few minutes ago. It says the subpoena requested that Mr. Trump appear on November 14 for deposition testimony in Washington or by video conference, and for the production of documents by November 4th. In a letter to Mr. Trump, the committee said its investigation showed that, quote, you personally orchestrated and oversaw a multi-part effort to overturn the 2020 presidential election and to obstruct the peaceful transfer of power, unquote. And then, Kim, it notes that Trump has not said one way or another whether he intends to cooperate with this subpoena. I mean, this looks like an even more complicated case because the root of executive privilege is the separation of powers between the president and the Congress, the legislative branch. And who better to claim executive privilege than the president, the executive? And so it's interesting. I guess I expect that President Trump will not ignore the subpoena. As we've discussed on a previous podcast, it still seems pretty unlikely to me that he intends to go up on Capitol Hill and testify. So we may get another court case kind of testing the bounds of what Congress can compel of the executive branch.
Yes, which is why I really wish the committee hadn't gone down this path. They have now compiled huge amounts of information. They've also very clearly rendered their judgment already. It isn't as if anyone can be in any doubt as to how the committee feels about Donald Trump's behavior and what they feel that he engaged in. So there's a couple of problems here. One, the legal one, is this a good precedent that you want to be setting for the future? If you can call up a former president and make him appear before Congress, what are the boundaries of that? Can you call a sitting president and make him sit before Congress? And what, again, are the bounds of executive privilege? This one, as you say, would be far more clear cut, and I would find it hard to believe that there wouldn't be courts that would have real pause about giving Congress that kind of license to ask any question they want of a former president. So there's that, but there's also simply the merits of this as well, too. Do we want this committee to simply move forward now, issue its findings, issue its recommendations, or do we want to keep going on with this? I mean, I keep laughing and asking myself, what if Donald Trump were to actually say yes? Do they really think that this is going to be productive, having him sit in front of them on televised TV, going back and forth with them? It would certainly be interesting TV, but I'm not sure it would be very helpful for the nation or for the cause of what the committee itself says it's trying to do here.
Let's take a couple letters from listeners. Rod says, can you expand on why states are giving inflation relief checks and how anyone can think that's a good idea from an economic perspective? And the state that comes to mind here, at least to me, is California. I was looking up the details of their inflation relief payments. Apparently, it's called the Middle Class Tax Refund, and it's coming by direct deposit. It ranges in size from $200 to $1,050, and it will go to about 23 million taxpayers in California. And I have a hard time thinking of how this makes sense from an economic perspective, but I can't explain it from a political perspective, Kim, which is that voters love the guy that is writing them $1,000 check. And for inflation, they blame Washington. They don't blame the governor of California, who, by the way, happens to be preparing, it seems, for a presidential run in 2024.
Yeah, but that's why it's a particularly cynical move on Newsom's part, because economically, look, what's our problem right now? We have too much money floating around the economy, and Newsom's answer is to float more money around the economy by giving people dollars that they're going to then use to further engage in this wage price spiral that we're seeing at the moment, where they'll have extra dollars in their pocket to buy more goods, which will increase the pressure on prices, et cetera, and so on. Why it's cynical is because Newsom's not going to have to take responsibility for this. It's going to wash its way out in the national indicators, and it's going to be the Biden White House or Congress that takes responsibility. So good for Newsom, I guess. And yes, he is certainly getting ready to maybe do his own bid, but he should be careful what he wishes for, because inflation, once it begins, can be very difficult to put back in the bottle, especially especially when Newsom and others are engaged in tactics like this. And let's say he were successful in 2024, he could be taking over an economy that looks like it's in a lot worse shape than it is now.
We have another letter here. This one is from Greg. He says, can you explain the mechanics of how Biden is paying for the student loan forgiveness? If Congress isn't appropriating the money, is he just printing more money? This is a little bit interesting because I'm looking at a Congressional Budget Office memo on the cost of these student loan cancellations. And President Biden is claiming that he has legal authority to do this, that Congress has given him the legal authority to do this based on the pandemic emergency. So that's the answer of acting without Congress. As far as the money goes, it's a little complicated because the money has already gone out the door as the student loan. So what's left is the asset of the future payments from the borrower coming back into the government. So this CBO report says the present values of expected reductions of cash inflows to the Treasury are calculated by discounting those flows as specified in federal law called the Federal Credit Reform Act. And it talks about how the reduced cash inflow from the student loan forgiveness is expected to occur over the next 30 years. And so it's a little fascinating, Kim, because he's forgiving this money, which has an effect on the federal budget, but he's forgiving it in terms of reduced revenues decades down the line.
Yeah, I think the straightforward way to think of this is that it isn't as if the Biden administration is writing a check to anyone. This is money that is owed to the federal government, and he is simply telling people you don't have to pay it back. Now, that does have consequences in terms of federal government finances and spending in that regard, in that if that money is not coming in and Congress had been relying on that money to come in to pay for other projects that it has, and now that simply disappears, it either leaves other projects unfunded for which Congress will then have to appropriate more money, or it leaves a deficit, which will go on the debt. And in that regard, it's pretty sneaky the way that the Biden administration is doing this. It wouldn't be able necessarily to get away with something like this if it just simply wanted to send a check to student borrowers or other people in need. It wouldn't have the authority, and Congress would indeed need to sign a bill that would give them that funding. But because, again, this money is gone already, and it's simply a question of writing off the repayments, they can get away with it and stick Congress with the bill for the missing dollars.
One last thought, this one for me on the student loan business. We've had some headlines in the last couple of days about these lawsuits that have been filed, and particularly one by 6 states, including Missouri, that has been dismissed by a federal judge. Judge's conclusion is that these states lack standing. And Kim, I wonder if you read much into this, or is this the first salvo in this legal battle? And there are other lawsuits pending. And also, this is the first ruling by the district judge. And undoubtedly, this is going to go to the appeals courts and maybe to the Supreme Court. And so this is not the salvation of Biden's student loan forgiveness just yet.
Yeah, not at all. We now have numerous lawsuits. They've all been filed by different parties. The courts are going to take a very close look at each one on their individual merits and decide whether or not the plaintiffs in the case have standing. And as we've talked about on this show before, standing is very important. Courts take it as a baseline before they'll even look at a case, because we don't necessarily want an environment in which everyone's running around suing over things that are unrelated to them. So you have to prove to the court that you will directly be injured in some form or fashion. People can debate over the merits of this particular decision, but it is what it is. And again, it's the first step. I would note, however, that watch this space going forward, because the Biden student loan process is now online. It's happening. Some deadlines have been set for things to really start progressing over the next month. So there's going to be a new sense of urgency about getting the courts to look at this and potentially stopping this before the money, as it were, goes out the door, because once that happens, it's going to be an awful hard thing to claw any of it back.
Thank you, Kim, and thank you all for listening. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button, and we will, of course, be back next week with another edition of Potomac Watch.